Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're taking a really close look at the human rights situation in Zambia.
That's right. We've got quite a stack of sources here, reports, constitutional texts, analyses.
Yeah, and they paint a pretty complex and sometimes, frankly, concerning picture.
Yeah, feeling nuance.
So our mission today, as always, is to unpack this material for you, our listener. We want to give you a clear grasp of the allegations, the key events, the bigger picture.
Help you get informed on what's a really critical issue.
Exactly. And just to be clear up front, we're focusing on presenting the information and the claims as they appear in these sources. We're not endorsing viewpoints, just conveying what's reported.
And what's quite fascinating, I think, is how these individual stories, these cases, when you put them together, they seem to suggest a larger pattern, something that, demands attention.
Right. And we'll be looking not just at specific incidents, but also the legal and constitutional frameworks that are reportedly under pressure.
Exactly. The whole context.
Yeah. Okay, let's jump in then. Our first major focus area. The sources spend quite a bit of time on the final years of Zambia's sixth president, Edgar Lungu.
Mm-hmm.
What are the core allegations surrounding his treatment, particularly regarding his health and freedoms?
Well, the materials we reviewed, they lay out a timeline. And it seems to start, or at least sharpen, around September 2023.
Okay.
So on September 7th, there's a documented denial. Lungu requested to travel to South Africa for a medical review.
Right.
And the Deputy Secretary of Cabinet denied it, reportedly, with no explanation given.
No reason cited.
None cited in the source, no.
Mm-hmm.
Then, just over a week later, September 16th, another incident. Officials allegedly forcibly removed him from a flight.
Forcibly removed? Where is he going?
To Seoul, South Korea, for a World Peace Conference, apparently. The reason given this time was lacking cabinet clearance.
Okay, but his legal team disputed that.
They did. They argued that for a former president, no such clearance was legally required, so a direct clash there.
And the impact of these incidents, what does the sources say?
Well, twofold, really. First, obviously, it delayed his access to specialized medical care he was seeking.
Success.
But also it added significant stress, uncertainty, which the sources suggest undermined both his health outlook and his political activities.
That's quite something. Was it just travel restrictions? Or were there other ways his life was reportedly impacted?
No, it apparently wasn't just travel. The information we have also points to something maybe seemingly smaller, but significant in context.
What's that?
His morning jogs. In that same month, September 2023, police reportedly labeled his public jogging sessions as political activism.
Jogging, political activism.
That's what's reported. And effectively, they banned his public exercise.
Wow. And the alleged impact of that?
Well, the sources argue it denied him, simple, healthy practices while he was already dealing with illness, likely worsening both his physical and mental well-being.
So it sounds like a cumulative effect being described.
That's the picture painted, yes. Now, looking at the period after that, say late 2023 through to mid-2025, public reports were apparently sparse. But the materials we have assert that his access to, timely, critical medical services was blocked or delayed, intermittently at least.
And his family spoke out.
They did, publicly criticizing the UPND government, that's the current ruling party, for what they termed gross mistreatment, neglect, and political pettiness.
Strong words.
Very. And the sources connect this to his health conditions, things like achalasia, cardiac complications. They explain these can be seriously exacerbated by treatment delays and stress.
Which brings us to the tragic outcome.
Yes. He passed away on June 5th, 2025, in Pretoria, South Africa. He was 68. Died from cardiac complications during surgery.
So he did eventually get to South Africa for treatment.
He did, by early 2025. But the allegation, the core point the sources make, is that the preceding years of alleged denials, they likely worsened his underlying health issues, narrowed the window for effective intervention, perhaps.
And the sources draw a direct link.
They assert that these obstructions contributed materially to his health decline and death. They cite medical delay principles, family testimony.
But they also acknowledge.
They do acknowledge that proving direct causation is, impossible. It's a very difficult thing to establish definitively.
It really highlights a potential gray area, doesn't it? Using administrative processes, maybe with potentially devastating results.
It raises serious questions about accountability when delays rather than direct actions are implicated. And there's another layer here, too.
What's that?
The Benefits of Former Presidents Act, Chapter 15.
Okay.
Item 10 in the schedule specifically provides for medical insurance for the former president and his spouse.
So he was legally entitled to health support.
That's what the law seems to state,
Yeah.
which makes the alleged denials or the difficulty in accessing care even more pointed. Why weren't these benefits effectively accessed if entitled? That's a key question raised.
Okay, let's broaden out from Mr. Lungu's specific case. The sources, as you mentioned, suggest his experience wasn't isolated. They talk about a wider pattern. What evidence do they present for this idea of systematic political persecution?
Right. Several sources detail what they describe as targeted persecution and selective justice.
Meaning
Essentially a pattern of harassment, arrests, detentions aimed at opposition leaders, pro-democracy activists, often using administrative charges or, criminal charges that are described as weak.
Are there specific examples cited?
Yes, quite a few. Besides Edgar Lungu himself, his family members are mentioned: Esther, Tasila, Dalitso Lungu, also prominent opposition figures like Chishimba Kambwile, Chilifia Tayali, Fred Memembe.
And the nature of the cases against them.
Described in the sources as being on dubious grounds or thin. The core allegation is that the criminal justice system itself is being weaponized.
Yeah.
Used to silence legitimate opposition or criticism.
Weaponized. And how else is the legal system allegedly being used?
Well, the materials also talk about the abuse of legal system and laws.
Such as?
They point to things like the Public Order Act, a colonial-era law reportedly being used to restrict assemblies, stop protests, that sort of thing.
Okay, using old laws in new ways.
Potentially, yes.
Oof.
Also, the cybercrimes and cybersecurity laws are mentioned, cited as tools that undermine free expression, journalism.
Right. We see that concern in many places.
Indeed. The overall picture presented is a clear pattern of abuse of legal system to target arrests and prosecution of political opponents and critics.
And is there anything particularly insidious mentioned, specific tactics?
One tactic highlighted is the relocation of trials to distant towns.
Why would they do that?
Well, it's described as a form of punishment in itself. It increases costs dramatically for the accused: travel, accommodation, legal access. It adds risk.
And isolates them, presumably.
Exactly. And the sources tragically link this to the Kambwile case again.
So it seems like these aren't just legal technicalities being discussed, but actions with real, sometimes devastating human consequences.
That's certainly the implication drawn from the materials we've reviewed. It suggests an erosion of trust in the legal process itself, potentially turning it into an obstacle rather than a safeguard.
Okay, so this alleged pattern of targeting individuals using the legal system, what does it all mean for, the basic freedom of expression in Zambia?
Well, the sources point to what they call a growing trend to attack dissenting voices. Basically, a suppression of dissent and freedom of expression.
How does this manifest?
One way mentioned is how media outlets, reportedly those affiliated with the ruling UPND government, frame things.
Frame things how?
They allegedly portray criticism, opposition activities, not as political discourse or dissent, but as law enforcement issues.
So casting political opposition as somehow criminal.
That's the interpretation in the sources, yes. Creating a veneer of legality to mask what they argue is actually political repression.
And what about journalists or media outlets themselves?
Reports suggest that journalists airing opposition viewpoints have faced harassment, intimidation. Some radio stations have apparently been shut down or even attacked.
That sounds serious. How does this square with Zambia's own constitution?
Well, that's a key point of tension highlighted.
Right.
Article 20 of the Zambian Constitution is titled Protection of Freedom of Expression.
And what does it say?
Subsection 1 is quite explicit. It guarantees, unless a person consents otherwise, freedom from hindrance in enjoying freedom of expression. That includes freedom to hold opinions without interference, freedom to receive ideas and information without interference, freedom to impart and communicate ideas.
Pretty apprehensive.
Yes. And it specifically mentions freedom from interference with his correspondence. Subsection 2 adds protection for the press. No law shall make any provision that derogates from freedom of the press.
Are there limits allowed?
Yes. Subsection 3 does allow for restrictions. For public safety, defense, morality, protecting reputations, things like that. Standard limitations.
But the sources suggest the actions being reported go beyond those limits.
That's the strong implication. That the alleged harassment, shutdowns, the framing of dissent as crime. It appears to stand in stark contrast to the spirit and letter of Article 20. It raises serious constitutional questions.
Okay, so we have the alleged systemic issues, legal frameworks, but then there's another specific case detailed in our sources, a particularly harrowing one involving a former MP, Jay Jay Banda.
Yes, this account is deeply disturbing and really underscores the potential human cost of the alleged climate.
What happened, according to the sources?
Jay Banda disappeared in Lusaka back in May 2024. He reappeared the next day but was hospitalized and reportedly disoriented.
And he made allegations.
Extremely serious ones. The sources detail his claims he accused 3 State House officials by name.
Who were they?
Presidential Political Advisor Levy Ngoma, Communications Specialist Clayson Hamasaka, and a UPND youth leader, Trevor Winden.
And the accusation?
Abduction, torture, and sodomy. He alleged being brutalized with objects like wires, pliers, wooden planks. Just gruesome claims.
Horrific. Did he take legal action?
Yes. In June 2024, he filed a formal petition with the Lusaka High Court. He sought a declaration that his treatment constituted torture, violating his rights under specific articles of the Constitution, Articles 11A, 13, and 15.
So a direct legal challenge based on these terrible allegations. What was the official response?
Well, one of the accused, Clayson Hamasaka, publicly denied the accusations, called them false, and said they were endangering my family.
Understandable defense. And the court case. What happened there?
This is crucial. In October 2024, the High Court dismissed Banda's case.
Dismissed. On what grounds did they rule on the allegations?
No, and this is the key point the sources emphasize. It was dismissed not on its merits, meaning the court didn't rule whether the torture happened or not.
So why was it dismissed?
Due to failure to prosecute. Apparently his lawyers didn't appear in court for a hearing, a procedural dismissal.
So what are the implications of that, according to the analysis we have?
Well, it raises profound questions, doesn't it? You have these incredibly serious allegations, torture, sexual violence allegedly by state officials, deeply alarming.
Absolutely.
But the case gets dismissed on a technicality, a procedural issue. This means there's no formal finding of guilt or innocence.
Which effectively shields the accused officials.
That's the outcome, yes. It shields them from accountability in this specific legal avenue, at least. The sources argue this whole episode exposes a potential fragility in the legal process and due process in Zambia, especially for high-profile critics facing grave risks.
It sends a chilling message, perhaps.
That's what's suggested. The sequence disappearance, alleged torture, then the legal case evaporating on procedural grounds. It could imply an environment where dissenters face extreme physical danger with potentially limited recourse through the justice system.
Given all these serious allegations, both the systemic ones and specific cases like Lungu and Banda, were there calls for change? External input, maybe?
Yes, the sources do reference a UN Special Rapporteur's visit and subsequent report.
Okay, tell us about that.
Irene Khan, the Special Rapporteur focused on freedom of opinion and expression, visited Zambia in January 2025.
And her findings.
Her report did acknowledge some positive steps, like the adoption of an Access to Information Act and repealing the old law on defaming the president.
So, some progress noted.
Yes, but she also highlighted ongoing challenges regarding freedom of expression, and she stressed the need for more legal and policy reforms.
Any specific recommendations?
Quite a few. Things like actually implementing the Access to Information Act, decriminalizing defamation entirely, revising parts of the penal code and other laws seen as restrictive on speech, bringing them in line with international standards.
So reform the laws, strengthen institutions.
Exactly. Strengthen media, state institutions, tackle disinformation, speed up reforms, be more transparent. Pretty standard, but important recommendations.
Was her visit smooth? Did she meet everyone she needed to?
Well, there's a critical detail mentioned in our materials regarding that. Apparently, Parliament authorities denied opposition members the chance to meet with her.
Really? Despite government assurances?
Despite assurances, yes, that she'd meet all stakeholders. So that itself raises a flag, according to the sources.
Okay. Now, despite the UN report and its recommendations, our sources seem to argue quite strongly that the report's language might actually, well, understate the reality.
Yes, that's a major point of contention they raise. They feel the diplomatic language perhaps doesn't capture the severity of the situation as they see it.
Can you unpack why they feel it's an understatement? What specific points do they make?
Okay, they break it down. First, the idea of selective justice, as the UN might frame it.
Yeah.
These sources say that doesn't capture what they call orchestrated persecution. They give examples like the public arrests of Esther and Tassila Lungu on property fraud charges.
Right, you mentioned them earlier.
Yes, and the seizure of multi-million-dollar assets before any trial. They describe this as looking more like political theater than impartial justice. Or the arrest of an independent MP, Binwell Mpundu, reportedly just for a Facebook post, then subjecting him to high bail remote court appearances. They see that as deliberate silencing.
So persecution, not just selective justice. What else?
Second, the concept of remote and obstructive justice.
The trials in distant towns.
Exactly. The sources argue this isn't just a technical or procedural issue. It's a form of punishment. And they explicitly link it again to the Kamwili tragedy, where his brothers died traveling to one of these distant courts.
A devastating example.
And they mention Chalifia Tayali facing charges in faraway towns, cutting him off from family, lawyers, public view. They call it intentional legal entrapment, not just an inconvenience.
Okay, what's the third point?
Media manipulation. They argue it's not just something needing a recommendation for reform, it's being used as a weapon. They claim UPND-linked outlets actively framed investigations into Lungu's family as, righteous anti-corruption fights, deliberately ignoring or downplaying the political context alleged by critics.
Controlling the narrative.
Precisely. And they reiterate the harassment of journalists, the shutting down of radio stations' actions aimed at silencing dissent that go beyond simply having restrictive laws on the books.
And the final point of divergence from the UN's emphasis.
It relates back to President Lungu. They state that health and liberty violations go far beyond speech limitations. Meaning, when Lungu was barred from travel for medical care, physically stopped from boarding flights, that wasn't just a challenge to freedom of expression. They argue it delayed his care, contributed to his death, and was a constitutional crisis that cost a life.
A much stronger framing.
Much stronger.
Yeah.
And similarly, labeling his jogs as political activism wasn't just about speech. It was a direct intrusion into personal freedom and public health, they contend.
So the overall conclusion from these critical sources, what's the bottom line they present?
The bottom line, as presented in these materials, is stark. They argue what's unfolding isn't just a policy gap or some institutional weaknesses. They describe it as a deliberate system.
A system designed to
suppress dissent, harass critics, abuse legal processes, control media narratives, and even endanger lives all, allegedly, for political gain.
That's a very serious charge.
It is. It's presented as a politically weaponized regime that, in their view, has become a threat to Zambian democracy itself.
Right. So, to wrap this up, we've covered a lot. We've looked into these deeply concerning allegations about human rights, political persecution in Zambia. We've examined specific cases, former President Lungu, Jay Jay Banda, and the broader systemic issues highlighted in our sources.
A complex and troubling picture based on the reports.
And again, just to reiterate for you, our listener, we've really focused on laying out the information and the claims as they appear in the source material we were given, impartially.
Trying to understand the dynamics being described.
Exactly. And understanding these dynamics, these alleged challenges to governance and human rights, it's crucial, really, for appreciating the complexities that can arise in any democracy.
Absolutely. And maybe, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it leaves us with a vital question to ponder.
What's that?
In any society, when foundational constitutional rights like freedom of expression, access to justice, protection from abuse are reportedly challenged or undermined, especially through the alleged manipulation of the very systems meant to protect them.
Yeah.
How can citizens, how can civil society ensure accountability? How can they make sure the rule of law is actually upheld, not just on paper, but in practice?
That's a critical question indeed, a vital consideration for anyone, anywhere who's committed to democratic principles.
Something to think about.
Definitely. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's been informative, and we encourage you, as always, to keep learning and engaging critically with the information you encounter.